respectful, or someone's being polite or nice to you when they really don't like you very much. And so that's where the idea of this politeness not being real has sort of, become part of the, popular culture. So there's that aspect of it. Then there's the aspect of words themselves. So there were certain words, and there still are certain words that, on regular broadcast television, and previous to that, just in general, in public, you just didn't say. You didn't use certain language. Unless you were really with a group of rowdy media, that was pretty much established. So throughout the 40s and 50s and 60s, it wasn't that this language wasn't used, but it was used. It wasn't used in what they would call polite company. If you were with a group of rowdy people, amongst themselves. Um, since there was such a split between African Americans and whites, African Americans had their own comedy clubs and their own music clubs and nightlife that they would go to. A lot of times there were elements of African American society where you'd have comedians that would use language like that. Perhaps the most famous of them was Mr. Red Fox. Now, most people, if you remember Red Fox at all, you remember him as Fred Sanford on the Sanford and Son show, where he was this kind of silly, funny old man, and you never heard any dirty words come out of his lips. Well, his stand-up career was all about that. I mean, he used language in a way that predated what Richard Pryor would end up doing much later. And he was doing it in the 50s, but he was doing it, within the circuit of certain groups of people that he knew would respond to that. African Americans, from a certain, also from a certain strata, social strata too, that he understood and knew how to use that language and knew that they would respond to that language. And that language was real to them. And it was a release for them. So this was a place they could go where they wouldn't have to watch what they said. They could say what they felt. So, somewhere in the 50s, this began to be challenged. I think probably first was, and it seems to be mostly challenged by comedians who wanted the freedom to tell off-color jokes. I think that's really where it started. And so maybe Lenny Bruce was probably the first one to start challenging, why do we have this thing about words? Why do these certain words, why are they not allowed? Why are they? And in those days, using certain words, certain language was illegal. It was enough to get him arrested several times. And so he had a real problem with that kind of approach. And he was the first of the comedians to really challenge that in a way. Legally, if you're wondering about the legal aspect of that, it basically using that sort of language or talking about certain things would have been considered indecent. And indecency is a legal issue. It's akin to like indecent exposure. If you walk down the streets with no pants on, you could be arrested. It was seen as being tantamount to the same thing. And he went through legal battle after legal battle, and a lot of those legal battles opened the door for, performers being able to use language in ways that might be a bit shocking, but also were part of their right to freedom of speech, and also could be used as part of creative expression. And then that was followed by George Carlin, who had his famous 7 words you can't say on television, in which he talks about these 7 words that people find so horrible that you're not allowed to say on television. And in those days, you couldn't. There was nowhere you could say these words on television or radio. Nowadays, with cable, of course, there's all kinds of words being used, and much more than 7, I would say. And these are all good things, by the way. And I mean, these are all social mores that needed to be challenged and talked about and thought about. But what's happened is, as that door opened and as it became more and more acceptable to use, language in creative ways to get a point across, it also began to be misused. And I would cite, and again, this is just my perspective on it, but to me, the beginning of that kind of thing came with people like, I think probably Imus. Don Imus was the first to really begin that. But then, what's his name? I'll remember it. But anyway, he was another radio performer who, he's still on the radio today, who makes his living out of talking about the most coarsest, vilest things that they can possibly do in the most, tasteless and provocative manner. And then that kind of approach, and it really was kind of a swaggery kind of approach. Listen, I'm going to say whatever I can say because I have the right to say it, and nobody has the right to, shut me up about it. And of course, there's some truth to that. But there's also truth to what you say creates an environment that you might not particularly care for eventually. And then we begin to see this approach being used not so much in entertainment anymore, but in discussion of serious issues. And we first see this with Rush Limbaugh. In his talk show in the 90s, he began with an approach that was very similar to the shock jock approach in talking about politics, name calling, insults, outrage, all of this kind of thing. And that began to become not only acceptable, but because he was doing so well in the ratings, it began to be what everybody strived for in discourse. Now you could no longer have political conversations without there being this, bloodlust and insults and so forth and so on. And this has continued on in many of the pundits that we have. I mean, I like Jon Stewart a lot, and what he did for The Daily Show was a lot, but it also amped up the idea. I mean, making fun of politicians whom you don't agree with by making fun of their, facial appearance or their language, or making up, insulting names about them. This is what all of this is based on. And while it's funny in the immediate, and people may, get a giggle out of it, the power of words is such that it begins to degrade, even though you may not even understand. It begins to degrade you, and it begins to create and send out messages that you might not want to be sending. And so ultimately we end up with a discourse that sets the stage for someone like Donald Trump to say the things that he says and be able to be a successful, presidential candidate. Many people find that, horrifying, and it's just very, it's very confusing to me. I mean, it's like, really now you find this horrible? After years of saying the most outrageous things that you can get away with, now you think there's a problem? And a lot of this I put at the doorstep of this new media where we have comedians who are political pundits. And sometimes this is not to say they are not bright and brilliant people with interesting perspectives. It's just that when they are the arbiters of political thought, okay, and when they are the distributors of news as well, which is what they've become, because they're entertaining, people will tune to them for information, and they'll get the information, but their adherence isn't to the information. What they care about, because they're comedians, this is what they get paid to do, they care about the joke. That is the most important thing. And when that's the most important thing, then what happens is discourse has to unravel. So here's where I want to get to with the power of words. And my goodness, this half hour's almost already gone by, and I haven't even had a chance to focus on the other things, but I think it's important to talk about this. Words are, there's a dichotomy here. It's sort of a conundrum. Words are at once meaningless and very, very powerful. Words are meaningless in that they're just words. And as an example of this, I'll tell you about an incident that happened to me when I was young, elementary school or something, and someone had called me the N-word out on the playground, and I went home that day and I told my dad about it and told him, somebody had called me this word. I knew what it was, and I knew it was a bad word, and I knew, that it was not something that was a nice thing to say. And my dad turned to me and he said, you don't worry about that word. That word has no meaning to you. That word has nothing to do with anything that you are. That word says more about the person who uses it than it does about you. It says nothing about you. And, I took that lesson to heart, and over the years I've really realized that, words hurt us when we let them, when we take them at a certain level. In other words, I see the N-word now. If someone comes up to me and says that to me, it's like, well, imagine if someone ran up to you and called you a purple hippopotamus. Now, you might be a little puzzled. You might be a little amused. And you might see that the person saying that doesn't mean it in a positive way, but you can't really understand what they mean. Would you be offended by being called a purple hippopotamus? Well, of course not, because it doesn't mean anything to you. would you be outraged or, you know, uh, go on the attack because somebody